So, I mean, what motivated you to first start to read and think about IPE?
Good question. I've always been interested in the world, and I've been interested in different ways of looking at the world. I started out studying art, literature, studied industrial relations, studied a bit of economics, kept changing the subjects that I was interested in because basically I wanted to understand more about the world. And I ended up doing a PhD in sociology in terms of my academic trajectory. So I've never actually taken any courses in the two areas that I'm known for, which is international relations and what I call global political economy. And I know you wanted to ask a question about whether the term IPE was appropriate. And I think if you look at the world from different perspectives, I mean, in retrospect, I think what I've been trying to develop, without sounding grandiose, is a little bit close to what Brodel called the perspective of the world. You have to try and look at the world from different vantage points, from below, from the basic ways in which people live, the way that they communicate, their cultures, the way that the cultures connect to their systems of political economy, to the relations that they have with other peoples, with powers, and so on. And if you look at that trilogy by Brodel, Civilization and Capitalism, between the 15th and the 18th centuries, he tries to look at everything from above and below to try and get a comprehensive and integrated picture of the world. So I've always been interested in that, and as it turned out, at a certain point in my life, I got interested in international political economy, as it's conventionally called. And it was really when I got my first ever permanent teaching job that I began to really get into it. I did an MA in American political theory, so I was always interested in the question of America and America's place in the world. As you mentioned, other people have mentioned American imperialism. And when I was beginning to get into that, I was conscious of the ambivalence, the contradictory nature of this, what I later called a universal contradiction. You've got the civil rights movement, you've got the student movements, and the US was still pursuing war in Vietnam. So I was interested in more those kinds of questions and how you could understand them, how you could begin to relate to those issues. And then I went to Wolverhampton, and I was appointed to teach political theory and American politics for my first permanent job. And I was in the shower after an indoor football match, and the then chair of the school that I was in, a man called John Wildsmith, a very nice fellow, said to me, "Oh, by the way, Stephen, we decided that we'd like you to teach the Introduction to Economics for the BA Economics students." And I said, "Well, when?" And he said, "Well, at the beginning of term, which was about 3 weeks away." And so I had to teach for the BSc Econ students all the first year economics, including all the tutorials for the whole cohort of 80 odd students. So I learned a lot about economics in a very short period of time.
There'll be people watching or listening to this interview right at the start of their career and perhaps have a similar experience.
Well, yeah.
Is there any survival tips you would give from that time?
I can only say what I did, whether it's a survival tip or not. But what I decided to do. So I read a lot of interesting and radical stuff on American politics, and I was interested in the debates, especially on the new left in the United States. And I read many of the things that people who were more progressively inclined would look at. So I decided to create this course as a debate between the orthodox and the heterodox. And the two textbooks that I used were Paul Samuelson's textbook, which is probably the best known textbook in economics, and another one by Hunt and Sherman, which was called something like Economics, Orthodox and Radical Views. I can't remember the title of it, but what I did was I divided up the readings week by week as a debate between the two and got the students to debate. And I managed to keep about a week ahead of them in terms of preparing the course. In those days, you had to do things like indifference curves. You used to have draw them out yourself. There was no technical aids. And, what I did was I had to work very, very hard. I was promised that I would teach American politics, which I eventually began to do 3 years later. And the political theory I was able to do the following year. But I had to do that plus a hodgepodge of other things because they were just starting up loads of degree programs. And you probably remember the Council for National Academic Awards. We used to, it's possibly a bit before your time, but it used to be the case when the old polytechnics were being created in university form, they had to validate their degree programs externally. So you couldn't just mount a degree the way that you would at Manchester University or York University, where I work now. You had to get them approved by a central authority, which was called the Council for National Academic Awards. So we had to basically prepare these lengthy documents, and then we would have a visitation from the great and the good, some very senior academics from other universities who would, run the finger over whether our courses were feasible and were up to date and so on. And we got a lot of courses through, but the secret at that time, including for me teaching the economics introduction, was I went to talk to colleagues and got advice from them and help from them. And we worked with each other and we all helped each other out. We were very, very collegial and lots of young faculty that helped each other. And it was very creative because they were all similar age to me. They were, shared outlook. And what they wanted to do was to create an integrated social science degree and to improve the economics degree and, introduce more political economy and so on. So I got lots of help. And I would work until 10 o'clock at night and then go to the pub and have several drinks and hope to get to sleep. And I get to Friday, and then I go with everybody to the pub afterwards because it's very collegial. We'd all go with the students. And then I'd sleep all day on Saturdays and then get up on Sunday and think, wow. But I got through it somehow.
It doesn't matter if you don't want to tell this story, but often when we speak in the pub or, over a meal or something, and perhaps because we come from the same place or whatever, but you often tell a story of the kind of background in Leeds. And I don't know if you wanted to kind of elaborate on that kind of life story.
Well, as I said, Brodell and many other thinkers, look at life from the bottom up. I mean, I was also a literature student, so I read lots of novels and so on. And novels and historians tend to look at the big picture. I started, in a poor working class background. I was the only boy in my school that ever passed 11 plus for I think over 30 years. And certainly I was the only member of my entire extended family that ever went to university. And my father had, I think, 9 or 10 brothers and sisters, and my mother had 4 sisters. So that's basically because of the class system and the way in which it operated. But the class system did at least give an opportunity after the Second World War to people like myself to go onto university and to make good. But so that was obviously very important for me because it enabled me to understand some of the peculiarities of the English, so to speak. One of which is its perverse class system, and its even more perverse concept of pedigree, as if that matters to people. But it does matter in British society, and in fact the current Conservative government seems to value people precisely according to their pedigree as opposed to their intelligence and capabilities. But that's a political comment on the Brexit miasma that we're now going through. But so that background actually was very important for me, and it enabled me to see things from the vantage point of most people, as opposed to people who were in comfortable positions, who were used to having clear expectations about the future. Not that I really knew what I wanted to do, and I was just talking to your sons upstairs about the past, and they said, well, what did you want to do when you were growing up? And I told them one of the things I wanted to do was to be a DJ, and they all guessed the kind of DJ that, or at least Sophia got the DJing right. And the other thing I wanted to become was a professional footballer, and I trialled for Leeds, but in neither case was I good enough. And I also wanted to become an artist, a sculptor. And I was good enough to get into art school, but my parents, who were working class people, said, no, you must become a teacher, get yourself a secure job. So all of that shaped my upbringing, but I've always been interested in doing many different things, and I never really stuck with one thing over time. And when I went to Wolverhampton, I took those experiences with me, and I met David Law. David Law was the polar opposite to me in terms of personality. He's a teetotaler, non-smoker. He doesn't drive, and he only finally settled down and got married, I think, when he was in his 40s. And a very shy man who stammers a lot, but a very, very intelligent, thoughtful person. Actually, he went to Manchester University and he did his master's degree in economics there. And a very, very thoughtful development and international economist. Came from a Methodist family, very devout family, but ethically a very clear-minded person and very knowledgeable about the global south in general, and about parts of Africa and the Southeast Asia in particular. And he encouraged me to think about doing work in international political economy. We shared a lot of readings together, and then we developed a course. We had to wait, we had to have it approved and so on, but we eventually began to teach it. And then we decided that we were going to try and write a book, which is this book. And it's the most important book I've ever done. And it was an attempt to create a way for people to generally approach the field. It is conventionally called IPE, but we called it global political economy. Do you want to know why we? Well, because most of the problems that we see around us, most of the bigger problems, are by definition global. Obviously, climate change, ecological changes, but 24/7 integrated capital markets, global communications grids, movement of people. You have, enormous 4 billion people are tourists every year, and so on. So there are all of these interconnections and things which can't be understood through, a simple reductionism of jurisdictional boundaries or simple systems of exchange. So it's not, to use the jargon that we later used, which I did with Isabella Backer, power production and social reproduction. We wanted, it was the first attempt to sort of go beyond the states and markets type of framework, which is often conventionally used as a lexicon, and to introduce power and production. The social reproduction came later when I started to work with Isa Backer. And we thought of it as, ontologically global, but also ethically global, because the questions that we're facing are questions to do with the survival and the flourishing of human beings and the planet. So, and we actually have this in the book. We sketched this out, and we tried to lodge what we were doing in terms of the longer standing traditions of political economy, the great figures, particularly 19th century thinkers, who looked at the big picture. They had an integrated conception. So I've always been leery of this IPE moniker, because I felt it was too restrictive. And well, I could say more, but it probably just bore people. But when we first conceived of this book, we were unknowns from Wolverhampton, and we sketched out a plan for the book, a proposal. I think it was 10 pages with a summary of what each chapter would be, and we submitted it to the publishers. The British publisher was Harvester Wheatsheaf, the US publisher was Johns Hopkins University, and they had it reviewed. And I won't mention any names, and I won't say anything, cast aspersions on the International Political Economy Group of the United Kingdom, but when it was founded by Susan Strange, who, by the way, she encouraged me to do all of what I'm doing here, and I can speak to that as well. But she, that one member of that group, and Susan was not party to this, decided, having been asked by a publisher to review the proposal, to take it to the other members of the IPEG group, who convened in smaller numbers in those days, I think a couple of dozen people at the most, and circulated this to the group to see if it met their approval, and they thought it was feasible, which I think is fairly unethical behavior. And the response that was communicated by this individual to the publishers was it could never be done, that it could only be done in an edited book where different chapters were done by different contributors. and this we were then told by the publishers that they wouldn't publish it because it couldn't be done. So I got on the train to Brighton to see the publisher, and I had a difficult lunch with him, and persuaded him that they were all wrong.
Wow.
And you're a Yorkshireman, you understand this, you're from Leeds.
Yeah.
If somebody tells you can't do something and you're from Leeds, you're going to prove that you can.
Makes you more determined.
So that's how I got into all this. And this was my foundational work. And it took David, we had a very high teaching load there, and it took David and I 5 years from starting to write the book to finally get the manuscript finished. It's 180,000 words. I think it's 17 chapters. So, and it's got things in it which, since then, the field has tended to just drop or not notice in a significant way. For example, it has the usual conceptual stuff: power, structure, hegemony, particularly the power of capital, where we develop that concept, and other key economic concepts such as terms of trade and so on were in there. But it also had all the usual subject areas such as money and finance, trade and investment, production and transnationals. But it also had a chapter on oil and energy and how central that was to the post-war global political economy. It had a chapter on North-South. It had a chapter on East-West and communist states, because communist states actually existed when this was published in Eastern Europe and in China today. And it also had a chapter on militarization and military-industrial rivalry. And it concluded with two future-oriented chapters, one on the future of American hegemony and the global political economy. And then the final chapter was on scenarios, different scenarios, where we did something that Robert Gill did and Robert Cox did in their work. And we sketched out different scenarios of the future and we evaluated them. And the one that we felt was most likely at that period was the transnationalization and the liberalization of the global political economy. And that is more or less what occurred since. So I think it stands up. And the key thing about that, and again, this, another influence, of course, when we were doing a lot of reading for this was Robert Cox, but Cox's work is very future-oriented. He's historically grounded, but his notion of history is that history is not the past. It's the making of history. And I think that that's a key thing that many people in the field are just not focusing on. Because, we ought to be seeking to help to make history, to understand it, and to try and at least channel some of our mental energies towards making it a more livable future for people. When this book was reviewed, it was reviewed by the Times Higher Educational Supplement, which we were very pleased about. It's a very nice review. And the review heading was The Big Picture. And I think that is my main contribution, to be able to look at the big picture of the world. Not that in my view of the big picture is wholly adequate. Nobody's ever could be, but to try and look at the big picture as a contradictory but nevertheless dynamic entity which creates all these levels of subordination, inequalities, possibilities, opportunities, and so on. But to see it as a giant or big picture. And in terms of the perspective I apply to this, again, to get back to the Brodel, it currently, of course, it's a perspective on civilization and capitalism. And I'm really interested in, and I think I'm making a contribution to asking the question about how those elements of the world contribute to the health of people and the planet. And I want to think about the future of people and the planet. We'll get to this later, but in terms of current work, Isabella and myself and some other colleagues are launching precisely a research program on that question about the future of world order.
Okay, so we'll come to that in a second. I mean, I don't know if you want to say anything about ideas like the structural power of capital, disciplinary neoliberalism, institutionalism, which the kind of institutionalized world order kind of stuff that you've been particularly known for.
Yeah, well, I can. I mean, you had a question. There is a question that you sent to me about disciplines. I'll come to disciplinary power capital in that light, because I think that'll relate it to the academic.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
But as I said, I've got sort of two identities that people connect to with me, but they're actually both interconnected: the international relations and the global political economy. Another key book that I did, disappointing cover, unfortunately. Cambridge University Press was not known for it, the grandeur of its covers, because this has been a series. I'm very proud of this book because I think it's one of the few books in the field, in both fields, that actually deals with the ideology and consciousness of a major component of the world ruling classes. So it is the view from the top. And one of the reasons I did this was I started the research for my PhD, and I did that, by the way, when I was teaching full time. So it took a while to get the PhD finished. But Steve Berman, who was an Americanist at Birmingham, he's now at Sussex University. He encouraged me to engage with the powerful thinkers and the powerful figures if they were prepared to engage with me. So I did, and discovered that this organization that was founded by David Rockefeller, and involved 300 plus very powerful, virtually all men, drawn from both political and civil society throughout the world in the richest countries of the world, who were not richest non-communist countries in the world. We're trying to produce a framework, a shaping of world order, and the shaping was roughly consistent with this transnational liberalism notion. And they were seeking to outflank communism or to incorporate communism. They had a strategic objective, and they had a language of their own, which very rarely used the word capitalism, but they were all pro-capitalists or were capitalists. So I engaged with these people, and I did a research program which involved me doing 140 in-depth interviews with people like David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Paul Volcker, really significant figures, to try and understand what they were trying to do in a precise way, both in terms of their intellectual frameworks and the ideology that they would use and the form of consciousness that they had. And I had done some research seminars in Wolverhampton on methodology and the philosophy of social sciences, on the concept of ideology, and on the Great Transformation, and these were all relevant to this. And so I studied ideology a lot, and this was a work that was principally a work in ideology and consciousness, but it was on the terrain of class formation and the ruling elements in the global political economy. And I don't think it'll ever be done again, anything like that, because I was an unknown person. So I really didn't pose any threat to any of these people. But it took me a few years to get round the houses, and I did interviews in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, and produced this book. So that's something, again, in the field that you don't see enough of. You see the Amsterdam School, for example, they talk about transnational class formations and so on, but none of them have actually gone into the belly of the beast to actually really find out more about them. So I think that's an important contribution.
As a quick footnote to that comment, it's actually, I give that book, finally got a copy of my own copy of it after having read it as a PhD student. I give that to every single PhD student that I work with, and say, if you want to know how you actually do really good critical scholarship that isn't just some vague ideas about class formation, etc. This is how you do it. And I think it's, when was that published?
91.
Yeah. And it still stands up.
I hope it does. I mean, actually, by the way, I have all of the interviews and the documentation from that, and I'm creating an archive at York University so future scholars can use that if they ever should.
That would be great, yeah.
There is also a Cox archive that's being created there as well with this paper. Some colleagues are doing that there, so that'd be a resource for people.
I wonder if there's something to be said about the contemporary moment there as well, because that group of people very much shaped an institutional and ideological environment that broadened itself out. So perhaps for 20 years after that point in time, it wasn't as if there was a small cadre running the world economy. But perhaps we're in a moment of time where there is quite a small group of people that are shaping, the way in which institutions, or at least attempting to reshape the way institutions are working against a kind of liberal transnational.
Well, yeah, the hegemony of the, if you could call it kind of a liberal cosmopolitanism connected to the dominance of transnational capital. It's ruled the roost for many, many years, but its contradictions started to really surface with the 2008 financial crash and the almost thoughtless and heartless way in which the powers that be in many countries reacted to that and imposed austerity and so on. And that, I think, created the context for people like Trump to become electable. And it's very clear that they have a kind of reactionary transactionalism, which is juxtaposed as the major alternative project of dominance right now. And you can see it surfacing in all kinds of other contexts. Bolsonaro is an example, and in a sense, Bolsonaro reflects precisely the logic of this, with fostering the interests of agribusiness, trying to use every possible means, including constitutional and other means, to destroy the left, being willing to sacrifice the Amazon. And it's the future lungs of the earth and biodiversity, and he's very consistent with Trump. So there is a huge attack on a world order which already was unsustainable, but these are people that are going to make it even more unsustainable. But there are a lot of other forces at work as well. Marx talked about the sixth great power in Europe, which was the power of the emerging working classes. Well, if you think about it on a much more global level, that's a narrow way to think about the question. In this book, for example, and in other places, I talked about the different elements that contest the world order, and I coined the phrase "a postmodern prince" to try and talk about a vast number of different forces that all have something in common, which is precisely the thing I'm interested in, which is making the world more of a possible world for people on the planet. And there are many examples of this. I mean, even now, this G7 summit that's just taking place, which is a bit of a pantomime, you can see very clearly that right now the pressure on the leaders to deal with climate change is so intense that they're going to have to do something. And you see that in boardrooms as well. Shareholders are pushing the big energy to move towards more renewable sources of energy to lower climate imprints. So right now, actually, the theorization of this, and this is central to this research program, is that we're in a kind of interregnum. That post-war order is beginning to show signs of disintegration. Some of the forces that are causing that disintegration are very reactionary, but there are also progressive forces that are looking towards a longer-term future. They don't just see everything as immediacy to do with consumerism to satisfy short-term needs. So it's a key moment, I think, in history. It's a convention, a kind of a historical turning point, or an interregnum, because the signals of the turning point are not entirely clear yet.
Great. I mean, did you want to say any more about disciplinary neoliberalism, or about new constitutionalism?
Well, there are. I sort of put together a troika of different elements in theoretically, and I'll come to the power of capital and disciplinary neoliberalism. First was market civilization, which is partly what I'm talking about. A consumerist, energy-intensive, me-oriented, possessively individualist, ecologically myopic perspective on the world, which is attempts to reproduce the overconsumption patterns, the pollution patterns, and all the rest of it to satisfy the needs of a relatively small proportion of the world's population at the expense of the planet and other people. And of course, that draws people in. It's drawn in, post-Soviet Russia. It's drawn in key elements in China, although under very difficult political conditions. because they hadn't seen an alternative pathway. So that's the central idea, that there is this civilizational complex which is driven by capital and the turnover time of capital, the accelerationist features of capital. And then, okay, what forms of political economy sustain it? So disciplinary neoliberalism relates principally to the political economy and governance forms, of which the legal and constitutional elements, the new constitutional elements, as I call them, have often been neglected. They are crucial to the nature of capital, how capital can accumulate, how jurisdictional power operates, how sovereignty operates, and so on. So each of these are, as it were, the cultural, civilizational, the political economy, and the legal, juridical are parts of a kind of a troika of forces which serve to constitute contemporary capitalism with all its contradictions and possibilities. And the power of capital issue and disciplinary neoliberalism, I think power of capital is both structural and direct. The structural feature is basically the context for action, the framework of action, the historical context, the historical structure is constituted in ways that tendentially favor the interests of capital and capital accumulation, and the capitalist state is beholden to those structures and is permeated by them. Whereas the direct power of capital is the thing that most political scientists would focus upon. They'd focus upon lobbying, electoral systems, various ways in which the capital can persuade and influence, and so on. And the two, of course, are interdependent. So that was connected to disciplinary power in my theorization, which is an idea that I took from Weber, Durkheim, and Foucault, but then I gave it the Gramscian and Marxian inflection, because the power is it drives deep into our society, so it's very capillary. It's disciplinary in the sense of its modes of inclusion and exclusion. Certain elements are included, certain elements are excluded, certain elements are punished, some elements are rewarded. So it's a system of incentives as well, and it permeates everything. So, for example, the question about, do I see IP as a discipline? Well, I see whatever we call the field as being disciplined by these structures. We live in a capitalist society where capital the reach and extension of capital has deepened to the point where it inflects everything that's done in our field. And it also inflects the way in which people gain rewards in our field, the incentives that they get. People are given money for doing research projects which are connected to what Cox would call problem-solving perspectives, to solve the problems of the system so it reproduces itself over time. And the people who are the more critical theorists, who see beyond and see alternatives or different ways of looking at the system, they don't get the big research grants typically. Not in all cases, but a good example, for example, is climate change. It's something that I'm very interested in. With climate change, there are many bright and good people thinking about all kinds of ways to deal with climate change, Green New Deals and so on and so forth. But basically it's to do with reorienting or recalibrating or rechanneling the existing system. So will it ever work? I personally have doubts that it can work, but certainly some of it's going to be very helpful. Anything that stops the relentless increase in production, the consumption of fossil fuels and so on, which will be good for the planet, is a very good thing. And of course, you need technical specialists to do this who will be problem solvers. But if you look at it from the viewpoint of the health and well-being of the planet and its people as an entity, as the biosphere, well, your problematic's completely different. You think about it in a different way. You think about making changes of a completely different order, qualitative order. So, that's a problem. It's a problem for the field. And it's the reason that problem exists is precisely because of this overdetermination of capital in the way that the agendas and thought processes of the field tend to operate.
Sure.
So if you were trying to think of not necessarily that specific problem, but trying to think about your kind of future orientation of where critical studies should go. Is IPE a good place to start that thinking from?
Well, it's a good place to start if you widen the conception, ontologically and ethically, to the global. That's not to say states are not important or the interactions across state boundaries, etc., is not important, but it's only part of the bigger picture. The thing I would say to are you asking for newcomers to the field or just people generally?
Yeah, I think so. Almost in a why bother coming and doing my third year undergraduate course on international or global political economy?
Well, I think it's worthwhile taking your course because it will widen everybody's perspective and horizons, and it will enrich their thought processes. So anybody that's capable of studying a course like that should do it. And I teach many undergraduates, but what I try to do when I teach them is always to say, look, you are the future. These issues that we're going to talk about, maybe when we talk about the 19th century and Polanyi, or we talk about 18th century capitalism a la Brodel, we're going to try and learn from that to understand today and where we might be going tomorrow. And I try to focus on the things which are germane to their everyday lives. But yes, they should, and they we don't have students that are necessarily as well prepared for courses at that level as you would at Manchester, because our students can basically say almost anything they want to do. It's like a cafeteria system, and you have to start from scratch in every course. But it's worthwhile, and the students seem to get a lot from it. But if I were thinking about going into it academically, well, the first thing I would say is it's bloody difficult. It's a really difficult field. I used to teach American politics, which was a piece of cake to teach and prepare by comparison. The time I was teaching it, there was still the great legacy of Ronald Reagan. I could tell stories about Ronald Reagan and his B movies and the fact that he wasn't really in control. He had Alzheimer's, and the astrologers were telling him what to do. I mean, that's easy, but global political economy requires a lot of concentration of thought and coverage of things. So if you start out in that, you've got to have a longer view in mind. And what I tell students who ask me that question is, I say, well, look, what's important for you? What was important for me was to understand the nature of power and the nature of justice and injustice in the world. That's what motivated me. So that's why I did the American hegemony thing. I did the research on the powerful. And I've done other things since, which are to do much more with articulating the question of justice and, power from below, so to speak. So it's very hard to do it, but it's worthwhile. And there's plenty of opportunities for people because it's still a relatively young field. And there's plenty of scope to do lots of different things. It doesn't mean to say you have to always have the big picture, but you've got to be able to do your particular piece of research, but somehow connect it to a bigger picture.
I don't know if you want to say some more about the kind of people that have influenced you. I know there's been a number of, there's some I know of and perhaps there's some I don't know of, but I mean, if you'd like to tell the story of those kind of human relationships that have shaped.
Right, well, I've already mentioned David Law, and I was speaking to David yesterday. It turned out that I never knew this actually, but my mother was 91 on Sunday, and he phoned me at my mother's, because I told him I was going to be there, and he told me that he was 73. He was having his 73rd birthday. He's older than me. So I wished him happy birthday. But yeah, we had a chat and caught up on a few things. But I'll never forget David. I mean, he's a very, very generous and patient person. So I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from another colleague who was an old friend, who I was later best man for, a sociologist, sociological theorist and criminologist called Frank Pierce. He wrote a book called The Crimes of the Powerful, which I'd recommend to anyone. One of the greatest books of criminology written in the late 70s, early 80s. And the chap who ended up being my PhD supervisor, Steve Burnell, was very important and influential. He encouraged me to do a lot of the things that I do. Very generous guy. Susan Strange was very nice to me. She was very supportive. She was my PhD examiner, where I had the shortest PhD examination on record, which lasted 20 minutes. she asked me 2 questions at the beginning. The other 9 men in robes were silenced. And she said to them all, "Gentlemen, I think we've heard enough from Stephen. Let's go and do the paperwork, and he can phone his significant other." So she dragooned them, she frog marched them out. And then she came back in and she said, "Right, Stephen, what's your poison?" I said, "Well, I'll have a gin and tonic." She said, "I'm going to make that a triple." So we went to the common room and had a drink together. But she was always very supportive. And by the way, she said to me afterwards, she said, "Look, I disagree with everything you say, but you say it very well, and I respect you for it." And she always encouraged me to do exactly what I do. So they were influential. And then, of course, these are individuals as opposed to thinkers. And I met Robert Cox through Susan. She first of all gave me Cox's manuscript of his book Power, Production and World Order. And she said, you probably want to read this. She said, "He said it to me, I've sent my comments back, but you need to read this." So she gave me the manuscript copy of it. And so I wrote to Cox because I was approached for jobs in North America. And I said, "What can you give me some advice? Because I don't think I'm going very far in academia in Britain." And he wrote back saying, "Well, they're all good places to go to, but you might want to consider applying for a job here." So I did. But Susan introduced me to him. And of course, he was a great influence at that stage. But the formative influences were those colleagues earlier on. And they introduced me to some of the thinkers that you encounter through reading, there's a whole vast range of those. Yeah.
And what's the current project?
Well, actually, I've forgotten one other significant individual who has been a significant influence, because I happen to be married to her. And I'm not saying it because she's my wife, but what Isa enabled me to do was to completely look at the world in a new way when I went to Canada, much more than Cox, because Cox is much more kind of a conventional patrician type of person. But she introduced me to a lot of new things, and I learned a lot from her. And by the way, I learned a lot from David Law, and I learned a lot from Isa. And in terms of the people I've learned from the most, they're probably the 2 most important individuals. Yeah.
And the current project you're working on now?
Well,
or future project?
Yes, it's. Let me just find the title of it for you. I never remember titles too well. It's called Power, Production and Social Reproduction in the Making of World Orders. And as I said, it's a research program which involves. Actually, there's one other person that's been influential. That's part of this group, which is a physician, a senior physician called Solly Benatar, who used to be the head of medicine at the University of Cape Town, and he works at the University of Toronto as a visiting professor. And he's taught me a lot about health, looking at the world. He's a bioethicist. He's one of the world's leading bioethicists. So this is a research program which, between Isa Bakker, myself, and Solly Benatar, are the core people, and several others who will be working with us. And a number of our PhD students have been involved in this, and they're very enthusiastic about the whole thing. But it's basically looking at world order from those 3 broad dimensions. So when we were talking earlier about Bolsonaro and Trump and so on, versus the post-war advocates of the liberal international economic order, and that liberal hegemony is there, plus the contestation from below, and also the elements of power that stem from exclusions and inclusions. So therefore, we're looking at settler colonialist societies in particular, and the way that they've dealt with Aboriginal peoples and the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples. So different dimensions of power. Then production, which is basically 2 flanks. One is the restructuring of production, particularly connected to the introduction of machine learning, automation, labor-displacing technologies, service-oriented technologies, surveillance in the workplace, other elements in the restructuring of production, and their links to both migration, flows of migration, and sort of the politics of labor, And then the other flank in the production level, which connects to the third, is energy and climate change, and the contestation over the future concerning climate change, everything from Green New Deal versus Extinction Rebellion. And then the final flank is on social reproduction and health, which is mainly to do with care and well-being. I don't think we've got enough resources to look at education in any detail. It's very important. The work you're doing on that's very important, by the way. And that will really focus on the restructuring of healthcare systems and global health, but looking at it from the vantage point of planetary health, planetary in the double sense of the people on the planet and the biosphere. And there will be a deeper focus on inclusion and exclusion, not just inequality, but elements that are connected to the governance thereof. And a lot of that will be connected to the nature of migration, the idea being that even though international migration is relatively small globally, real migration, i.e. people moving from one part of a country to the other, typically from the countryside to the city, is gigantic. 4 billion people in the last 15 years have done that, mainly because of the restructuring of production or seeking shelter from environmental dangers or from dispossessions or whatever. There is a whole series of factors that are causing this, but all of that is really intimately connected to the restructuring of social reproduction on a world scale. So we're looking at those three flanks and then how they fit into the governing and geopolitical structures of world order. So it's meant to be at least a 5-year research program involving, well, hopefully we'll get the research money for it, which we might not do because it's critical, but our students are really into this, our PhD students. They've been really interesting in terms of us developing this, and I have a happy 4 weeks when I get back to write it up before it has to go in.
4 weeks.
Yeah, not very much because I've been terribly busy this year. But that's the plan, to do that.